Hey y'all, it's the last week of formal class, although we do have some time next week to do a very light final exam. It's much more of a bigger reflection, similar to what you've been doing most weeks with between the reading prompts and the sort of class activities. The final exam will be very similar to that, but just a little bit larger and more sort of meaty in terms of thinking about the entirety of the class. But for the most part, I just want you to focus on those final papers. That is the most important sort of product from this class. And so we will be communicating in the next 2 weeks to get all of that sort of stuff done and turned in this week. So this week, the topics are a little disparate, but they get mashed together. What is an accident? Sort of talking about accidents and unintentional injuries. Those are one of the highest rates of morbidities in all populations in the world, but especially for younger people. And yet it's something that we don't really often think about, particularly here in the US. We know that for younger people, usually under 35, accidents are one of the number one causes of death and dismemberment. And so it's something we should talk about, right? But it's an accident. And so what does that mean? And how do we even conceptualize those sort of things? And then the other part of the week is focusing on mental health. Both mental health and accidents and injuries often get overlooked. And so that's why I have them sort of smushed together, because there's not a lot of data and there's not a lot of information on these sort of things worldwide, because we barely have good information on them in sort of high information countries. And so they are hard to stand alone in separate sort of weeks. And so I usually put them together to create enough content for an entire week. So first, I'm going to tell a little bit of a story about why infrastructure matters. How does this relate to sort of safety and health, accidents, those sort of things. And so I always like to call it why infrastructure matters to health and safety, or otherwise known as the worst day of Lindsay's life. Now, usually we're in class and it's a much more interactive sort of dialogue, but here we are, COVID lecture videos. So I'm going to tell a little story, partially because it's a cool story. Secondly, because I'm a storyteller. It comes from both my sort of family background and my cultural background. Native American sort of literature and history has been always an oral tradition, and so I very much embody that in a lot of different sort of ways. And so I'm going to talk about some stuff that happened. So I have some slides with some pictures going on in the background that help guide sort of the story if you're a visual person. So prior to going to my PhD program, I worked for a doctor named Dr. Mercy Obemi. She is a Nigerian American, and she was born and raised in Urumi, Nigeria. And she immigrated when she got married to her husband, who was also Nigerian, and came to the United States. She's a very famous doctor in Indianapolis and also worldwide. She does a lot of really cool stuff. But she also does, or did, at the meantime, we're not currently doing these, but for a very long time, we did medical trips, medical philanthropy trips to her home village in Nigeria. I first met her as part of my master's program. I had to do a project and an internship for my MPH, and I did those with Dr. Mercy Obemi. That's how I got sort of invested in this sort of stuff. And she had just started a couple of years prior, returning to her home country and delivering medical services in a 1-week clinic for indigent people in her home city, which is pretty much everybody. So I, as part of my MPH project, did a quality assessment of her program. I made some recommendations, we worked really well together. From there, I continued to work with her, and eventually I was promoted to co-leader of these medical trips, specifically to deal on the volunteer side. We brought a lot of Americans, sometimes students, sometimes just general lay people, sometimes retired people. So she dealt with all the medical sort of stuff, and I dealt with the volunteer side of things. And we worked together to make this medical clinic go off. So Urumi, Nigeria is a teeny tiny place. When we first started going to Urumi, it wasn't even listed on any maps. We didn't have Google Earth back when we first started doing this, and so we didn't have maps of these sort of things. Now, with Google and other sort of things, you can easily look at it. And so one day I was thinking about this and I thought, oh, I should see what sort of distance, because when you're there and you're traveling, you just lose concept of these sort of things. What is the distance from Lagos, which is the former capital of Nigeria, to Urumi, which is where we delivered our medical services? We used to only fly into Lagos because it was the only place to fly into. Lagos is one of the largest cities in the world. It's also completely overwhelming in a lot of ways. There's so much traffic, there's some crime, there's just a ton of stuff. In fact, it's so bad that in Nigeria, the government used to be headquartered in Lagos, and they finally were like, you know what, Lagos is a hot mess, and so we need to move our capital, right? Could you imagine that happening here in DC? People are like, you know what, we're done with DC, let's just move somewhere else. But that's what happened, because that's very typical of Lagos. And so now the capital of Nigeria is in Abuja, which is in the middle of the country. But at the time that we were first traveling, it was very expensive to fly through Abuja, and you could fly into Lagos from Atlanta, and it was one of the fastest ways to get there. And so we would fly into Lagos, even though Lagos is very hard to navigate, and these sort of things. Historically, it would take us quite some time to get from Lagos to Urumi. So again, back to my sort of Googling, I decided I'm going to Google and see how far actually Urumi is from Lagos. And much to my surprise, when I pulled it up, it's only 250 miles, which is a lot closer than I thought it was. And then the Google Map estimate, you know, as they always have the driving estimate, said 4 hours and 23 minutes. And I was like, that's hilarious. Never in the history of ever has anybody gotten from Lagos to Urumi in 4 hours and 23 minutes in a car. I assure you of that. Generally, when we would go, it would take us 8 hours if we were having a really good time, 10 or 12 hours if we were having kind of a typical day. And you'll figure out why as I tell the story. This time, it turned out to be, again, the worst day of my life, and much more of a day. So Nigeria was taken over by a military dictatorship back in the 70s, and since then they've returned to democracy, but there are some issues, as is in most sort of African nations. And there's a lot of worry about military sort of dictatorships coming back up. And so they are supposed to have legal checkpoints at the beginning of every new state. So like here in the United States, if you would go from California to Nevada, you would stop at the border, check in sort of at a military checkpoint, move on to the next state, and then so on and so forth. And so we would go through 3 different states to go to Urumi. So there should be 3 legal checkpoints, right? Well, as we've talked about in this class, oftentimes governments are really corrupt and things happen. And Nigeria is no stranger to that. And so in Nigeria, a lot of times the military and the police and education and other sort of government workers don't get paid regularly or on time. And so they find other ways to make money. One of those ways for military and police officers is to increase the number of checkpoints that they have people go through. Because if you're the person with a gun and you are controlling the road and nobody's there to sort of provide those checks and balances, well, you can do kind of whatever you want. And so the day that we decided to travel, we are actually stopped at 23 different checkpoints, right? Again, there were 3 legal checkpoints, but we were stopped 23 times during the day at each checkpoint. Now, when you stop at a checkpoint, obviously that's everybody slows down, you have to stop, you have to talk to the people. What they're really looking for is bribes, right? That's the whole reason that they have these places, because they're like, yeah, the government isn't paying us, and yet we're stuck doing these jobs. Well, we got to make money somehow. And so what they try to do is shake down everybody who comes through their checkpoint. In, you know, the sort of scheme of things, they're like, yeah, just give us $1 and we'll let you go through. Well, if you have to do that to hundreds of people in a day, you can see how that could be kind of lucrative. And if you don't pay, then they hassle you and they harass you and they keep you on the side of the road and they do all these sort of things and try to wear you down, because they know that you're going to have another 22 of these checkpoints. And so they are betting that you'll just be like, fine, it's just $1. I'll give you the $1. Here you go. And then they keep moving. For a medical team such as ourselves, you can see how that would add up, number one. And number two, like, no, we don't want to participate in bribery. We're trying to do our medical sort of philanthropy to the people of Nigeria. We had done lots of different sort of things to try and work around this. We had gotten fancy car magnets printed up at Kinko's that said Mercy Foundation on them and put them on our cars because they looked super fancy with our logo on them. And those worked pretty good. We often got waved through checkpoints without even being stopped. On this particular trip, we had 3 cars. The first car was a Honda Civic that I happened to be in with Mercy's brother, Stephen, who was leading the way. Our second car was a supply truck, which was kind of this old, crusty, like, van thing that was on its last leg. And then our third vehicle was our passenger bus. We had a very large passenger bus that had all of our volunteers on it. I was up in front because I was doing a lot of logistical sort of stuff while Stephen drove. The week before, Stephen had come from Lagos to Urumi to kind of prep things for our arrival, and he had stopped at this one checkpoint and had some issues. In Nigeria, most of the cars are imported directly from external sort of places, in most cases from the United States or sometimes in Europe. And so Stephen's full-time job, he didn't full-time work for the Mercy Foundation, his full-time job was importing and exporting cars. So in Nigeria, when you import a car, you get paperwork when you're importing it, and then you sell it, and you have another sort of piece of paperwork that says, I've sold this car to so and so. Okay. Well, Stephen had imported his own car, and he didn't sell it because he owned it and he imported it. So he only had the first piece of paper, the import paper that says, I imported this car belongs to me. The week before, when he had been going to Urumi, they had hassled him and they're like, well, you don't have the transfer of title paperwork. And he's like, because I didn't have to transfer the title. I'm the one who imported it. My name is on the title of import. So I didn't need one. And they were just hassling him. And he is a very ethical guy and was like, yeah, I'm totally not going to pay you bribes because this is some BS. I imported this car. You have no reason to stop me. And I'm just going to keep going. And so he got delayed for about an hour arguing with these people, and they finally let him through. Okay, so that's going to be important later. But those are the sort of things that happen at these legal checkpoints. So as we were driving, another thing that you should know is that cars oftentimes there have second, third, fifth round sort of used tires. You use what you can until it literally will blow up or fall off. So as we were driving, boom, not a surprise, we got a flat tire. This happens quite often, especially when you're using used tires and other sort of things. Now I have a picture in the slides. That's not an actual picture of us because I hadn't taken one, but it's a bus on the side of the road just for illustrative purposes. Got a flat tire. Okay, we all had to get off the bus. The bus driver was working on it, changed the tire. You know, for a flat tire on a giant passenger van, took us about 30, 45 minutes as a sort of stop to change this flat tire. Okay. Then we started going again, right? And we're driving. Now, one of the things you should know about Nigeria is one of the #1 oil producing countries in the world. It's actually the 3rd largest oil producing country in the world. Yeah, a lot of people don't know that because you don't think of those sort of things. But the Niger Delta has a ton of oil. And so they do a lot of shipping of oil from the Delta all the way up to Lagos, where they will ship it off to other places to be refined and other sort of things. Well, because of the poor sort of vehicle maintenance, because of bad tires, because of this and that, because they overload stuff, oftentimes what happens is a tanker will crash and blow up. And when it blows up, it doesn't just blow up a little bit, it like blows up the whole road. And so this is just something that happens, and sometimes you'll be driving along and there'll be a giant crater in the road and you're like, oh, something must have blown up there. And then you just carry on your merry way. Again, a very weird sort of thing for Americans to think of, but it happens. And so as we were driving along, there was a huge blown up area that had blown up substantial amounts of the road. It must have been several tankers that had blown up, and we were like, whoa. And so they were doing a detour through the bush, which is sort of like the thick jungle density part of Nigeria. It was very lush and tropical in a lot of ways. And there was this itty bitty little like dirt road that went through sort of the bush to reroute around the blown up road. This road is something that you probably would ride a bike on, maybe. But we were driving a giant passenger van, bus, and then there were also people coming the other way. So 2 cars going each way. It was nutty. We actually were so close to the cars coming the other way that you could have put your hand out the window and touched the cars next to you. Also, it was a dirt road, and so we were going about 5 miles an hour or less, creeping through sort of this bush detour. We get right to near the end, and there's a creek, right? A creek. What? Oh, how are we going to cross this creek? Well, don't worry. Ingenuity strikes again. They have 2 giant boards that they are throwing over the creek that you drive your car over. And so for each car, there are 2 people there that you give some money to that are from the local village. And they are putting boards to match up to where your tires are. And then you drive across these 2 creaky boards across this little creek. And that's how you get through. I was like, oh my God, we're really going to die. This is just crazy. But we didn't. We made it through. But this whole detour, because it was a little tiny road path, they were all doing the, like board crossing of the creek and all this sort of stuff. This detour took about an hour just to go a couple of miles. And so again, we're running behind. We get out of the bush, we're driving along, and boom, we get another flat tire on our bus. Now, 1 flat tire, that's annoying, but we can manage with that. 2 flat tires, we've already used our spare. Great. Now what are we going to do? Well, we can't go back because that will take us back through the bush sort of detour, and that'll take forever, right? So we hang out on the side of the road. They take the tire that's blown and the spare tire that's blown, and they're going to drive ahead. And they don't really know where the next town is. They assume somewhere hopefully close. It was about a half an hour drive for them to get there. They took one of the passenger cars, the Honda Civic that I had been in, and while we just hung out on the side of the road. So it took them a half an hour to get to town. Took them about an hour to find somebody who could replace and patch the 2 blown tires that we had, and then they had to come back a half an hour. Then they had to change it again, right? So this detour of our second flat tire was almost a 3.5 hour ordeal that we were just sitting on the side of the road in the hot and just chilling and relaxing. This is why I was the volunteer manager. I have to keep people happy when they're like, why are we sitting on the side of the road in the middle of the bush? That's just the way it goes. Okay, so then we get to another checkpoint. Again, we're already, probably 6 hours behind from the flat tires, from the detour, so other sort of stuff. We've been driving and driving and driving, and we're all tired, we're all cranky, these sort of things. So remember how I said Steven had trouble the week before when he was going through? Well, we got to that same checkpoint and the same guys were there. And the same guys were like, hey, you don't have your transfer title paperwork. To which Stephen was like, are you serious? We had this discussion last week. It was a thing. We had a fit. Why are you bothering me? This is ridiculous. And they're like, we don't know what you're talking about. Even though they absolutely did. And Stephen was, of course, again, pissed of number 1, this is ridiculous. And number 2, we really just went through this. And number 3, I'm still not giving you any money. So they're arguing. And I'm just like, Stephen, I'm tired. Can we just give them, the couple bucks that they want? And Stephen's like, no, on principle, we are not going to do this. And I'm like, okay. So they're arguing. And then all of a sudden, for some reason, Stephen, I think, loses his mind and just slams on the gas and we take off. Okay, we just took off through a military checkpoint. But even worse, that guy who was hassling him, who was trying to get the money extorted from him, had been leaning on the car. And so when Stephen took off, he tumbled over. Now, as we talked about, masculinity is a big sort of issue in a lot of places. Well, yeah, guess what? That man's masculinity was severely hurt. And so he jumped up, angry as hell, and got him and his buddies into cars with their big giant guns and started chasing us. Again, I have pictures here in the slides. They're not actually the people, but it's pretty representative. So we're driving a million miles an hour, and I'm like, Stephen, what are you doing? You're going to get us killed? Why? What the heck? And he's like, this is just dumb. We're just going to drive and outrun them. And I'm like, yeah, I don't think you really thought this through. isn't really a solid idea. So finally, at some point, he's like, well, I guess we're not going to lose them, so I should pull over. And I'm like, huh. So we pull over on the side of the road, and guys jump out of their big giant trucks with their big giant machine guns and other sort of things and start walking up to our car. Now, I'm looking in my side view mirror, and I can see them change the clips for their like dummy sort of clip that they don't have and actually load it with a full clip full of bullets. And I'm like, oh my God, we're really gonna die. Now, one thing I haven't mentioned that I should mention is that Nigeria then was a cash economy. You couldn't use credit cards, you couldn't use checks, you just had to have cash. So for a big medical trip such as this, we carried about $15,000 in cash. And by we, I mean me. So I had $15,000 in cash and $100 bills, US $100 bills on my person. Yeah, $15,000 in cash, and guys with guns are walking up to our car. I was like, oh, yeah, this is totally enough money that they will just pull me out of the car and shoot me and kill me. So of course, as they're walking, I'm trying to figure out, what do I do with 15,000 US dollars and $100 bills, which if you've never seen that, is a lot of money. So I'm like, well, guess I got to stuff it in my underwear. And I'm trying to, because I was thinking, like, if they do take me out of the car and they are searching me, let's hope that they're gentlemen and won't get on my girly bits. And so that's where I'm going to stash all this $15,000 worth of money. And I leave just a little bit in my purse pack, so that if they see it, they'll still be like, oh, hey, we got $100. That's really great. But they won't think about the, $14,990 that are in my underwear at this point. So the guy walks up to my window and holds the big machine gun right up to the window right here. And I'm like, and he's like, open the door. And Steven's like, don't you open the door. And I'm like, I don't really know what I should do in this sort of situation. This seems like a lose-lose. And so he walks around to Steven's side and puts the gun at his window and says, get out of the car. And I'm like, Steven, if you get out of the car, they're for sure going to shoot you. And I don't really know what to do, but feels like leaving the car is probably a bad idea. Maybe if we're both in the car, maybe that's better. I don't really know. Around this point, our bus pulls up, and some of our other Nigerian men who were traveling with us jump out of the bus, and they come up and they're trying to talk to the military men. Steven, meanwhile, cracks open the window about this big and starts talking shit out the window. And he's all like, yeah, you're punks. Yeah, I'm not going to do these things. And I'm like, oh my God, can you please stop doing that? But he's, trying to be masculine and do his sort of thing. And I'm just like, oh my God, we're all going to die. So after what seems like forever, but was probably about an hour of phone calls to important people and this and that, finally we settle it. And the guys are like, okay, well, if you give us money, we'll let you go on your way. And so in the end, we still had to pay them money, and actually a lot more money than what we would have had to pay them if we would have just paid them the stupid dollar in the first place. But they let us go and we didn't die. Yay! Now, at this point, it's getting dark. In Nigeria, you don't drive after dark because it's dangerous. If you drive after dark, the likelihood that you'll get held up by robbers is pretty high. However, we have a giant medical team with a lot of Americans, and we don't really blend in, right? I don't look Nigerian. So we're at a point where we're at the largest city, and we're like, should we stay in Benin for the night, or should we drive the hour and a half until we get to Urumi? Now, there's no Hojo, no Motel 6 on the corner. You can't just walk in with a whole bunch of Americans and medical equipment and be like, hey, we need a room for the night. And so we stopped to grab some dinner, and we were like, well, what are we going to do? We're kind of screwed either way. We either go stay at a hotel that may not be safe with all these volunteers, or we drive and it's going to get dark and that's also not safe. So we were kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. We decided we would just try and go as fast as we can and get to Urumi. So that's our plan. Drive like hell and we'll get there safe, maybe. As you can guess, that plan didn't work out super well. So we're driving super fast, about 80 in these streets that don't have street lights because the Nigerian power grid doesn't work. Steven is driving 80 and we're watching in the back, in the rearview mirror, and our supply truck is just barely chugging along about 60. And Steven's like, they're not going fast enough. They're not going fast enough. If you go really fast, the robbers can't stop you, but they're going too slow. So Steven's calling the truck driver, and he's like, yeah, I literally can't make the truck go any faster. It's shaking as it is at 60, and it won't go any faster. And Steven's like, we are going too slow. This is bad news. We're driving, and then we're about a half a mile ahead of them. And all of a sudden, we pass through an area, and right behind us, motorcycles and trucks come out of the bush, and they cross over and they block our supply truck. Now, we're about a half a mile ahead, and so Steven whips the car around and turns his brights on, and we can see these men who are robbers pulling the driver of our supply truck out and beating the crap out of him in the middle of the road. This is not good. We're like, oh my God. And so Steven gets back on the phone. He calls his sister, who's in the passenger truck, telling her what's happening. They pull up, but these are robbers or bandits. They're not even like military that we could maybe negotiate with. These are just total robbers. And we're like, oh God, this is terrible. So we pull up, they pull up, and the robbers get on and then realize like, oh, I just pulled over an entire truckload full of Americans. This is probably bigger than what we thought it was going to be. In the meantime, some guys on motorcycles start driving towards us, and Steven's like, yeah, they're not going to come and bother us again because I have $15,000 on my body. So we turn around and start driving like hell to the next town. Finally, we get into the city. Steven pulls up at somebody's sort of compound and is like, get out of the car. And I'm like, I'm sorry, what? And he's like, get out of the car and go hide in that tree. And I'm like, you want me to get out of this car with $15,000 and hide in a tree on some stranger's property? And he's like, yes, I'll come back for you. And I'm like, oh, okay, sure, why not? This is what we'll do. He goes to the local police station. I hide in this tree for an hour. And finally, he pulls back up and he's like, okay, everything's fine. And I'm like, everything's fine. Okay. Apparently, they brought the police back. They were able to negotiate with the robbers. The robbers ran off before the police got there. Everything was fine. And so they come and pick me up. And then we finally made it to Urumi 14 hours after we left. Remember how Google Maps said 4 hours, 23 minutes? No, absolutely not. So I tell this story for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's a cool story, and it actually did happen to me, and that is always cocoa bananas to me whenever I tell that. But number two, when you think about all of the things that happened in that one single day, when we think about an accident, when we think about infrastructure, how does that impact people's lives? Think if that was your everyday life. Think if that was where you lived, and if you had to depend on roadways and safety and all these sort of things to just do your daily life. Is it any surprise that the health outcomes in Nigeria are pretty low? They got a lot going on. They have a lot to worry about. When you're worried about, can I even make it somewhere without crashing, without blowing up, without getting robbed, without all these sort of things, do you think you're really thinking about eating your fruits and veggies every day? Probably not. And so I think it's an important sort of concept when we think about these bigger picture stuff. When people have other issues on their hands, how are we supposed to even begin talking about other sort of health outcomes for them? How do we expect countries that are dealing with this sort of dysfunction and dysregulation to be able to dedicate time and information to health sort of outcomes for their populace? Okay, so that's usually my big sort of thing. I also want to touch a little bit on mental health and sort of the different cultural lenses of mental health. And so I have 2 videos for you to watch this week about different perspectives sort of on health and healing and mental health that I think are really important to sort of look at and compare and contrast in terms of what do we believe about health and mental health, and what do we believe about sort of religion and faith healing and some of these other sort of things. So I'll have you look at those this week as well. I think it's an important sort of thing because when we talk about mental health, we talk about here in the United States of like, oh, we're not doing enough for mental health. But how does that change when we go to countries that have a totally different conception of mental health? How do these things sort of work? And how do we have sort of these big ideas about these different sort of things? So that's it for this week. This week I'm going to have you, rather than do sort of difficult kind of stuff, I just want you to do a reflection on the course, since this is our last week, since I do want you to be focusing on your papers. And so this week for your reflection, I'm just going to have you reflect on this course. You know, what did you learn? What did you like? What did you not like? Tell me sort of your experience of this course, because I really do care about these sort of things. It looks like I'm going to be teaching online for one more semester, and so I always want to make the experience as good as possible given the constraints of COVID and online school. So that's it. I'll have a video for you next week just on some closing sort of thoughts, but it's nothing lecture-y. It'll just be a nice sort of message. So that's it. I'll talk to you later. Bye.